The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, Texas, 1873. Silas Blackwood stood 6 feet 2 inches of weathered determination, his once black hair now salted with gray at 45 years old. He adjusted his well-worn Stetson and surveyed the modest town that had been his home for the past 3 years. The former Union cavalry officer had built himself a respectable cattle ranch 10 miles outside of town after years of drifting, fighting, and building a reputation as a man who kept his word and his gun hands steady. His face, tanned and lined from years under the merciless western sun, betrayed little emotion as he tied his chestnut mare to the hitching post outside Holcomb's general store. His weathered hands, calloused from years of hard work, briefly touched the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit formed from years of frontier living where danger could appear without warning. Today was no ordinary day for Silas. Today, he would meet his mail-order bride. After years of solitude, Silas had finally conceded to the persistent nudging of Doc Matthews that a man needed companionship. Not just any woman, Silas had written in his advertisement. A proper lady who understands her place, respects a man's authority, and can maintain a peaceful home. The stage from Fort Worth was due any minute, bringing with it Catherine Spencer from Philadelphia. The woman whose letters had seemed promising, educated enough to teach his future children, but properly deferential to the authority of a husband. Her daguerreotype showed a comely woman with downcast eyes and a gentle smile. Perfect, Silas thought, for the orderly home he envisioned. The lonely nights in his 2-story ranch house, built by his own hands, would soon be filled with the gentle presence of a proper wife. He had everything planned out, down to her duties and the quiet, obedient role she would play in his carefully structured life. Would you please subscribe to the channel? I'd love to know what city you're watching from. The stagecoach appeared on the horizon, a cloud of dust announcing its arrival long before the sound of hooves and wheels reached the town. Silas straightened his best coat, checked that his string tie was properly aligned, and prepared to meet his future. He was not a cruel man, just a practical one who had seen too much chaos in his life. From the blood-soaked battlefields of Shiloh to the lawless frontier towns where he'd served as marshal before settling into ranching. Order, respect, and clear boundaries were not merely preferences for Silas. They were the foundational requirements of his existence. Catherine Spencer had agreed to these terms in her letters, expressing her desire for a stable home and a strong husband to guide her. Silas would provide that structure, and in return, she would bring gentleness and domesticity to his hardened life. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, and the driver secured the brake before jumping down to open the door. "Redemption Springs," he called out, offering his hand to assist the passengers. First came an elderly gentleman, then a young cowhand returning from some errand, and finally, a woman in a dusty blue traveling dress. Silas's breath caught. The photograph hadn't done her justice. Catherine Spencer was indeed comely, with chestnut hair peeking from beneath a sensible bonnet. But there was something else, something the daguerreotype hadn't captured. Her chin was held at a proud angle, and her eyes, rather than the demurely downcast gaze he'd expected, scanned the town with alert intelligence. Those eyes landed on Silas, and for a moment he saw something flash in them before her expression softened into the gentle smile he recognized from her photograph. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, approaching him with extended gloved hand. Her voice held the refined tones of the East, but there was a strength to it that surprised him. "I'm Catherine Spencer. I believe you've been expecting me." Silas removed his hat and took her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip despite the delicate glove. Up close, he noticed finer details: a determined set to her jaw beneath the polite smile, a straightness to her posture that spoke of inner steel rather than finishing school discipline. For the first time in many years, Silas Blackwood felt a flicker of uncertainty. He had ordered a submissive wife from back east, but the woman before him seemed to contain hidden depths beneath her proper exterior. Still, he reasoned, travel could put steel in anyone's spine. Once settled into his home and routine, she would surely become the compliant partner he had advertised for. "Miss Spencer," he replied, his voice a gravelly rumble from years of giving orders and breathing trail dust. "Welcome to Redemption Springs. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous." He offered his arm, which she took with apparent gratitude, though he couldn't help noticing how she continued to survey their surroundings with keen interest rather than the timid hesitation he might have expected from an Eastern lady encountering the rugged frontier for the first time. As they walked toward the hotel where she would stay until their wedding the following day, Silas was nothing if not proper in his intentions. He provided a brief overview of the town. "We'll be married by Pastor Wilson tomorrow at noon, if that suits you. Then we'll head out to my ranch. It's 10 miles from town, good land with a strong stream running through it. The house is solid, 2 stories. You'll find it comfortable enough, I expect." "I'm sure I will," Catherine replied, and if Silas had been more attuned to the subtleties of female expression, he might have noticed the slight quirk at the corner of her mouth. "I've always been adaptable." The comment seemed innocent enough, but there was something in her tone that Silas couldn't quite place. As they approached the hotel, Catherine paused. "Mr. Blackwood, before we proceed further, I believe in starting a marriage with honesty. My letters represented me truthfully, but perhaps not completely. While I understand the value of a harmonious household and respect the position of a husband, I should inform you that I've managed my father's household since my mother's death when I was 16. I've overseen servants, managed accounts, and made decisions when my father's business took him away. I am not unfamiliar with taking responsibility." She said this calmly, meeting his gaze directly. Silas stiffened slightly, but reminded himself that experience running a household was, after all, a valuable quality in a wife. "That's commendable, Miss Spencer. Such experience will serve you well in managing our home. But a ranch in the West is different from an Eastern household. Out here, a man's word needs to be final. The land and the elements don't forgive mistakes or hesitation." His tone was firm but not unkind as he established his expectations. "I've built my life on order and clear understanding. I expect the same in my marriage." Catherine nodded, her expression appropriately serious, though something flickered behind her eyes that Silas again couldn't quite identify. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I wouldn't have traveled all this way if I didn't believe we could build a successful partnership." The word partnership gave him pause, but before he could respond, they had reached the hotel entrance. The lobby of the Redemption Springs Hotel was modest but clean, with attempts at Eastern refinement in its furnishings. As Silas arranged for Catherine's room, the hotel proprietor's wife, Martha Simmons, bustled forward to greet the newcomer. "Miss Spencer, we're so pleased to have you. Mr. Blackwood has been walking taller since he received your acceptance letter." The older woman's eyes twinkled with good-natured mischief. Half the unmarried men in the county turned green with envy when they heard Silas Blackwood had secured himself an educated Eastern bride. "Come along now. I'll show you to your room where you can freshen up." Catherine thanked Silas with perfect politeness and followed Mrs. Simmons up the narrow staircase, her back straight and her head held high. Silas watched her go, a mixture of anticipation and that strange, unfamiliar uncertainty stirring within him. Tomorrow, he would have a wife. Tomorrow, his carefully ordered life would expand to include another person, for the first time since the war had taken his brother. Dinner at the hotel's small dining room allowed Silas and Catherine their first opportunity for extended conversation. Catherine had changed into a simpler dress of deep green that complemented her complexion and brought out flecks of emerald in her hazel eyes. Silas found himself unexpectedly tongue-tied as she gracefully took the seat he offered. "Tell me more about your ranch, Mr. Blackwood," she prompted when their food had been served. "In your letters, you mentioned expanding your herd. Have you acquired the additional grazing land you were considering?" The question demonstrated both memory of his correspondence and an understanding of ranching concerns that surprised him. As he described his operation, 500 head of cattle, 3 reliable cowhands, and the recent purchase of adjacent property, Catherine asked intelligent questions about water rights and breeding plans that revealed more knowledge than he would have expected from an Eastern lady. "You seem well informed about cattle ranching, Miss Spencer," Silas remarked, studying her with renewed interest. Catherine took a small sip of water before responding. "My father's importing business frequently dealt with agricultural products and livestock. I made it a habit to understand his business interests, which often meant learning about matters others might consider beyond a woman's concern." There was no challenge in her voice, merely a statement of fact, but Silas felt an implicit question in her words nonetheless. He cleared his throat. "Knowledge is valuable in any endeavor, Miss Spencer. I've no objection to an intelligent wife, provided she understands that final decisions regarding the ranch must rest with me." Catherine inclined her head slightly. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. May I ask, what duties will you expect me to undertake beyond the usual household responsibilities?" The directness of her question was refreshing. Silas had to admit, "I'll expect you to manage the household accounts, oversee provisions, and perhaps eventually establish a kitchen garden. The ranch house has stood empty of a woman's touch for too long." He hesitated before adding, "And God willing, there will be children to raise in time." At the mention of children, Catherine's expression softened genuinely. "I've always wanted a family," she admitted, and for a moment, Silas glimpsed vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. "My own childhood ended rather abruptly when my mother passed. I'd like to create something warmer." The moment of openness passed quickly as she straightened in her chair. "However, I should mention that I've also been teaching at a ladies' seminary in Philadelphia for the past 3 years. Might there be an opportunity to continue some form of teaching here, perhaps for the children of your workers or in town?" Silas frowned slightly. He hadn't anticipated a wife with ambitions beyond his household. "The ranch is quite isolated, Miss Spencer. Your primary responsibility would be our home, and eventually our children. The town has a schoolmarm already." He watched her face carefully, expecting disappointment or perhaps protest. Instead, Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. Perhaps there will be other ways to put my education to use." Her acceptance seemed genuine, though Silas sensed she was already considering alternatives within the boundaries he'd established. The remainder of the meal passed pleasantly enough, with conversation turning to lighter topics: Catherine's journey west, the characters she had encountered on the stagecoach, and Silas's laconic descriptions of Redemption Springs' prominent citizens. By the time they parted for the evening, Silas felt both reassured and strangely alert, as though he were sizing up not an adversary, but certainly a person of more substance than he'd initially expected. Morning brought clear skies and mild spring weather, as though nature herself approved of the union about to take place. Silas spent longer than usual trimming his beard and slicking back his hair before donning his best black suit. As he fastened his string tie, he caught his reflection in the small mirror and hardly recognized the man looking back at him. Gone was the hard-eyed rancher who measured life in cattle counts and fence lines. In his place stood a nervous groom, about to bind his life to a woman he barely knew. A woman who had already defied several of his expectations. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Silas Blackwood, who had faced down rustlers and survived the bloodiest battles of the war, found his hands unsteady as he placed his hat carefully atop his head and made his way to the small white church at the edge of town. The ceremony itself was brief and sparsely attended. Just the pastor and his wife, the Simmonses from the hotel, Doc Matthews, who had started this whole affair with his persistent advice about companionship, and a few curious townsfolk. When Catherine entered, however, a hush fell over the small gathering. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, not an elaborate wedding gown, but elegant and undeniably lovely. Her chestnut hair was arranged in a simple but flattering style beneath a small hat adorned with silk flowers. But it was the quiet confidence in her step and the clear, unwavering voice with which she spoke her vows that struck Silas most forcefully. This was no trembling bride being handed from father to husband, but a woman making a deliberate choice. As he placed the simple gold band on her finger, one that had belonged to his mother, Silas was struck by the sense that his life was changing in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The small reception at the hotel afterward gave the newlyweds little time alone, with well-wishers offering congratulations, and the women of the town sizing up the Eastern bride with mixtures of curiosity and, in some cases, thinly veiled envy. Catherine handled the attention with grace, displaying impeccable manners while skillfully deflecting personal questions. Silas found himself impressed by her social adeptness, another quality that would serve a rancher's wife well when dealing with neighbors and business associates. By mid-afternoon, they were in his wagon, heading toward the ranch, Catherine's trunk secured in the back, along with wedding gifts and supplies Silas had purchased in town. As they left Redemption Springs behind, the landscape opened up around them. Rolling hills covered in spring grass, stands of oak and cottonwood marking the watercourses, and in the distance, the purple shadows of mountains against the enormous sky. "It's beautiful," Catherine said softly, breaking a comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Different from Pennsylvania, but beautiful in its own way. Silas glanced at her, noting how the sunlight brought out auburn highlights in her hair. "It can be harsh," he cautioned. "But yes, there's beauty in it. The ranch lies just beyond that rise ahead. We should be home before sunset." Home. The word felt different now, with this woman beside him. Catherine's gloved hands were folded in her lap, but her gaze was active, taking in everything: the contours of the land, a distant herd of cattle, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "Tell me about the house," she requested. "You mentioned building it yourself?" Silas nodded, finding himself unexpectedly eager to share this part of his life with her. "Took me nearly a year. 2 stories, with a broad porch facing east so you can watch the sunrise. 4 bedrooms upstairs. I was thinking ahead," he added, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. As they crested the final rise, Blackwood Ranch came into view. The house stood solid and impressive, built of local stone for the first floor and good pine for the second, with a shingled roof and stone chimney. Around it spread the outbuildings, barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and corrals, and beyond, pasture land stretching toward distant hills. Cattle grazed in the nearer fields, black and red shapes against the green grass. Catherine's intake of breath was audible. "You've built something remarkable, Mr. Blackwood." The sincerity in her voice touched something deep within Silas. "Silas," he corrected gently. "I reckon you should call me Silas now." Catherine, Kate, as she'd asked to be called during their quiet journey, turned to him with a smile that transformed her face. "Silas," she repeated, and somehow her voice made his name sound different than it ever had before. They were met at the gate by Jeremiah, Silas's foreman, a grizzled veteran of the Confederate Army, who had set aside old animosities to work for the former Union officer out of respect for his fairness and knowledge of cattle. "Welcome home, boss," the older man called, then tipped his hat to Catherine. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet the woman who finally corralled this old bull." Silas shot his foreman a warning look, but Catherine laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to brighten the air around them. "Thank you, Mr. Jeremiah Watson, ma'am, but everyone just calls me Jem." Catherine extended her hand, which the surprised foreman shook carefully. "A pleasure to meet you, Jem. I look forward to learning about the ranch operation." The old cowhand cast a speculative glance toward Silas, who merely nodded stiffly. This would take some getting used to, not just having a wife, but having this specific woman as his wife. The tour of the house revealed Silas's practical nature. Solid furniture, minimal ornamentation, everything arranged for function rather than beauty. The kitchen was well-equipped but Spartan, the parlor barely used, the dining room dominated by a large oak table that could seat 12. "For when the hands eat with us at Christmas," Silas explained. Upstairs, the master bedroom featured a large 4-poster bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. Curtains of plain muslin hung at the windows, and the only decorative touch was a colorful quilt on the bed. "Simmons made that as a wedding gift last month," Silas explained, a hint of embarrassment in his voice at the room's austerity. Catherine ran her hand over the quilt's intricate pattern. "It's lovely. The whole house has good bones, Silas. It just needs some softening around the edges." There was no criticism in her voice, just thoughtful assessment. The cowhands, Jem young Billy Tucker barely 20, and the half-Mexican vaquero who went simply by Reyes, had prepared a wedding supper of surprising quality. Thick steaks, potatoes with wild onions, biscuits that had clearly been made with extra care, and even a cake procured somehow from town. They ate at the big table, the men initially awkward in the presence of a lady, but gradually warming as Catherine asked interested questions about their work and backgrounds. Silas watched, fascinated, as his bride drew out taciturn Reyes on the subject of horse training, and made shy Billy blush with her compliments on the biscuits he'd proudly admitted to baking. She was neither flirtatious nor condescending, but treated each man with genuine respect for his skills and knowledge. By the end of the meal, Silas realized his men were already half in love with his new wife. After dinner, the hands discreetly withdrew to the bunkhouse, leaving the newlyweds alone in the suddenly quiet house. An awkward tension filled the space between them as they both acknowledged, without words, the transition from public to private, from wedding day to wedding night. Silas cleared his throat. You must be tired from the journey and all the day's events. Perhaps you'd like to retire and get settled in our room. Catherine met his eyes steadily. I'd like to freshen up first, if you don't mind. Silas nodded, relieved at the reprieve. Of course, take your time. I'll see to the lamps down here. As Catherine ascended the stairs with dignified grace, Silas exhaled slowly. He had faced hostile Indians, gun-slinging outlaws, and charging enemy cavalry with less trepidation than he now felt at the prospect of joining his new wife in the bedroom that had been his alone for so long. After securing the house and banking the kitchen fire, Silas finally made his way upstairs. He paused outside the bedroom door, gathering his courage before knocking softly. Come in, Catherine's voice called. He entered to find her seated at the small dressing table, her hair loose around her shoulders, a cascade of chestnut waves that caught the lamplight. She had changed into a white nightgown with a modest robe over it, both trimmed with delicate lace. The sight of her, so clearly a lady, yet somehow not out of place in his frontier bedroom, made his mouth go dry. Catherine, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. This was territory for which his life experience had not prepared him. He had known women, of course, but never one like her, and never as a husband rather than a temporary visitor to establishments where transactions were straightforward and expectations clear. Catherine turned from the mirror to face him fully. Silas, she responded, and something in her voice had changed, the softening perhaps, or a new intimacy appropriate to their altered circumstances. I believe it's customary for husband and wife to speak frankly with one another, is it not? Silas nodded, moving further into the room and closing the door behind him. I've always believed in plain speaking, he agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure where this conversation was heading. Catherine rose from the dressing table, the movement causing the lamplight to shimmer across her loose hair. Then let me speak plainly. You advertised for a submissive wife who would respect your authority and maintain a peaceful home. I presented myself as such a woman in my letters, and I don't consider that dishonest. I do respect genuine authority, and I do value harmony. Silas felt a butt coming and braced himself. Catherine's hazel eyes met his directly. However, I cannot and will not surrender my own judgment or sense of self simply because convention dictates that a wife should be her husband's shadow. She took a deep breath, her chin lifting slightly. I came west for a fresh start, for adventure, for a life with more purpose than Philadelphia society could offer. I chose you because your letters showed intelligence, decency, and achievement. A man who had built something real through his own efforts. I believed, I still believe, that we could build a true partnership, one where your strength and my adaptability create something greater than either of us could alone. Her words hung in the air between them, a challenge and an invitation simultaneously. Silas felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The submissive bride he had expected was revealing herself to be something else entirely, not a defiant rebel, but a woman of substance and complexity, who saw their marriage as something more equal than he had envisioned. Part of him wanted to reassert his traditional expectations, to remind her of the agreement implied in their correspondence. But another part, one he scarcely recognized, was intrigued and even exhilarated by the prospect she offered. This was no simple country girl or proper society lady, but a woman of intelligence and spirit who had chosen him, Silas Blackwood, as worthy of her trust and partnership. For a man who had spent years earning respect through grit and capability, the recognition of those qualities by this remarkable woman was profoundly affecting. I'm not asking to make decisions about the cattle or to countermand your instructions to the men, Catherine continued into his silence. But I need you to understand that I cannot be a mere ornament or echo. I have thoughts, skills, and yes, opinions that may sometimes differ from yours. She moved closer, close enough that Silas could detect the faint lavender scent of her soap. I will be loyal, hardworking, and respectful, but as your equal partner, not your subordinate. Can you accept that, Silas? If not, we should determine that now, before. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Before their marriage was truly consummated, before it would be much harder to dissolve if their expectations proved irreconcilable. Silas found himself at a crossroads unlike any he'd faced before. The life he had envisioned, orderly, predictable, with a gentle, compliant wife managing his household, was being challenged before it had even begun. Yet something in him recognized that what Catherine offered was potentially far richer, if more complex, than what he had initially sought. He studied her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the determined set of her chin, the sensitivity in her mouth, and made his decision. I built this ranch from nothing, he said slowly. Made every decision alone, carried every burden myself. It's not easy for me to consider sharing that responsibility. Catherine's expression remained steady, waiting. But I didn't survive the war and the frontier by being a fool. Only a fool would turn away the kind of partnership you're offering. The tension in Catherine's shoulders eased slightly, though her gaze remained intent on his face. Then you accept? Silas nodded, a slow smile transforming his weathered features. I accept, though I make no promises about finding it easy. I've been giving orders too long to change overnight. Catherine's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains. I don't expect overnight transformation, Silas. Just openness to growth from both of us. She moved closer still, close enough that he could have reached out to touch her. I think you'll find that partnership has rewards that mere obedience could never offer. There was a new note in her voice, a warmth and promise that made Silas's heart beat faster. This woman, his wife, was offering not just her presence in his home, but her full self, her mind, her strength, and, he realized with sudden clarity, her passion as well. Later, as moonlight streamed through the window of the bedroom they now truly shared, Silas marveled at how completely his expectations had been overturned. The submissive Eastern bride he had ordered had turned out to be a woman of fire and substance, whose passion matched his own once unleashed. In the quiet aftermath of their lovemaking, Catherine's head rested on his chest, her chestnut hair spilling across his skin like silk. I think, he murmured, his fingers tracing patterns along her bare shoulder, that I got considerably more than I bargained for when I sent that advertisement east. Catherine's soft laugh vibrated against his chest. Are you disappointed? She asked, tilting her face up to his. In the moonlight, her eyes held both vulnerability and mischief. Silas shook his head, pulling her closer. No, ma'am. Surprised, challenged, maybe a bit overwhelmed, but not disappointed. Good, Catherine replied, settling back against him, because I have ideas for this ranch that might surprise you further. There was a teasing quality to her voice, but Silas didn't doubt she meant what she said. Strangely, the thought didn't alarm him as it might have just a day earlier. I reckon I'm learning to appreciate surprises, he admitted, his hand tangling gently in her hair. Outside, a coyote called lonesome across the prairie, answered by another in the distance. Inside the solid house Silas had built, something new was taking shape. Not just a marriage, but a true partnership between equals who had each found in the other something they hadn't known they were seeking. He had wanted us. Instead, he had found a woman whose hidden fire had transformed that world entirely, beginning with the surrender of his own heart on their very first night. Morning found them awakening to a new reality, the rising sun painting the bedroom in hues of gold and amber. Silas watched Catherine as she slept, the proud face now softened in repose, and marveled at how quickly certainties could change. He had spent years building walls around himself, walls of routine, authority, and solitude. In less than a day, this remarkable woman had not stormed those walls, but somehow slipped through them, challenging him to reconsider what strength truly meant. Perhaps real strength lay not in rigid control, but in the courage to open oneself to change and growth. As Catherine's eyes fluttered open, meeting his with sleepy warmth, Silas Blackwood, hardened frontiersman, former lawman, successful rancher, acknowledged to himself that he had indeed surrendered. And strangely, paradoxically, that surrender felt not like defeat, but like the most significant victory of his life. The coming days would bring challenges, adjustments, and occasional conflicts as they learned to blend two strong wills into one shared vision. There would be moments when Silas's ingrained expectations clashed with Catherine's independent spirit, times when the habits of solitude proved difficult to break. But there would also be unexpected joys. Catherine's laughter brightening the house that had been too quiet for too long. Her practical suggestions improving ranch operations in ways Silas would never have considered. The growing respect in the eyes of his men as they witnessed the harmony of strength meeting strength. And most precious of all, the deepening bond between a man who had believed himself complete alone and a woman who had crossed a continent to find not subjugation, but true partnership. In seeking a submissive wife, Silas Blackwood had found instead his equal. And in that discovery, both had found something far greater than either had dared to hope for. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left